The construction of the cult of the Confederate insurrection of the white supremacist Communist Party, birthed from the USSR, and their deals in order to provide to the lost causers through espionage the means of retaliation and successful destruction of the United States. Like Jörmungandr, the action of having ignored them passively allows them to grow stronger and stronger so that they may raise themselves and destroy the entire order of things, and that in the chaos of the existence materialize the eradication of the West, fulfilling the USSR's position to destroy the West without firing a single Russian bullet. And this having constructed in their system to be able to convince the conversion by the diversification of cults in degrees or layers of gnosis and understanding could materialize the ascensions in their hate groups, as the KKK had historically engaged in political, economic, social, and other violence. The bigoted violence engages in the overthrow of the society by ignoring them, and therefore the law not being forced against them allows them to grow exponentially to a tragic size, and the inevitability of our entwinement into the racism is our tolerance of their existence. And therefore the support of the hate crimes and the abandoning of order under the structure of Frazobolu, who gets those who need the existence of the order to abandon it so that they can engage in a self-harm, allowing for a cost-effective means to destroy their enemy, Western society. And as those who've made the deal with the devil engaged in the systematic breaking of the illusion of their false superiorities and competencies and ability to exist inside society, as they are systematically purged and their positions are being permanently banned structurally, reinforcing the position of the eradication or the very idea of them, as this in the diversification of the cults engaged in the capture of the various groups and their identities, such as the Italian mob, such as the Jewish mob, such as the Russian mob, and so forth. Therefore, the dividing of these structures inside of the United States and others have materially engaged in their support or defense, and therefore there is the least amount of law enforcement in order to make it look like they're doing something as an extortion racket, as they protect the criminal operations into maturity as the act of insurrection. This proving the structure engaged in the deal that they have with them, as they systematically make the settlements of these militias, who, having constructed the destruction of order, prevent the existence of the American government from doing its responsibilities for the civilian populations, as the promise is dissolved in absence of their loyalties to duty. And these derelictions of duty systematically validate the position from the extorters, and therefore they deal with the devil through the Confederacy, enforcing the white supremacist communism, such as with Prohibition, which, having been condemned for the express purposes of degrowth, have put at the OSSS and the CIA under Dulis's arrangement to replace the owners of the alcohol and other prohibited substances in order in the destabilized terrorist operations against those communities to be able to transfer to those that they had preferred under their mostly fascist, a little communist agreements, having centrally planned the outcome of the automation of those economic viabilities, overseen by Wall Street, which, having engaged in the function of managing or brokering the arrangements of the economy throughout the system, had systematically gotten away with financial crimes, and other subversions as they become more and more arrogant and diversified in their incorporations and entanglements with the government as they engage in these terrorist operations for the spreading and manipulation through the black market to conduct these crimes. And the development of these arrangements build to their larger structure their various corruptions. Thus, in this arrangement, their diversification to the thing under the Hegelian dialectic for the problem reaction fixed solution facilitate their ability to create those who would be destroyed by the mechanism of taking over the system. At the Greek tragedy of once Achilles receives the armor of the gods, the pinnacle of his power, this is when he dies, and thus the action of transferring the power to those they want to be killed at the height of the power is the mechanism of their destruction, as the system was never designed under the communist spell to be able to succeed, and therefore the arrangement of the destruction of those they wish to purge to get them to kill themselves off by the foolish trap go into that trap and endure to themselves as far as they could run. This being the seeding of their offer to the Jewish mafia to engage in the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, that they may enforce against the West all of these functions, which, having engaged in these operations, this distraction, this world spell, having materialized the action of the communist USSR and its arrangements as its continuation of the destruction of the West, materialized this particular path, which having at it their core identity as Jew haters, as anti Semites, use the bias of the bigoted violence to ensnare them into this role that they may grow beyond their means and be consumed by the overconcentration, which would inevitably collapse them. And they, doing this out of a systematic ritual, a series of traumas that require them to have accepted their place in all of it, fall in line with their predetermined and arranged death. As they systematically use the white supremacists who, claiming to be Christian, form a cult of Christian nationalists, which is neither Christian nor nationalist, and these arrangements worship the system of the devil religion, which is, in their eyes, according to the estimates, Islam, and the position of Islam is nothing more, according to their deeper knowledge, but Baal worship, the god of thunder from Canaan, and thus the action of them worshipping the god of thunder have materialized to themselves the histories upon their theory that when the ecosystem for all existence had existed in space, that they had the use of Odin and Thor and the rest of them as a floating ocean with an island formed of its various components, including resting upon large creatures, and thus the action of the world being born of its existence with creatures as its vessels materialize its histories that they may convey to themselves the ability to continue into this arrangement. And as the destruction of that world had conveyed itself, it would have found itself landed as a cosmic action landing into the planet, and therefore engaged in the evaporations necessary from the collapse from this colossal site, which would then have the entire ecosystem having conducted its exponential change of temperature by having fallen onto the planet to be able to create the vapors which become a consistent ecosystem which then allows for the diversification and the thriving of all of the life in the ecosystem, fed in perpetuity by that vapor, which becomes self feeding, the heat of it consistently evaporating the oceans, which, having been used to that temperature, sustains themselves at an equilibrium according to this theory as they restart the arrangement, and the birth of their god Baal, having been able to construct the evolution of the system of progress, would have added a weapon beyond what Thor would have had, so that he could have conquered the beast Jörmungandr, and therefore become systematically easier to dominate them, each recycled reincarnation, as the function of their belief founds them inside of the Middle East, which then went into Europe, which then, having acknowledged its prehistories as the division went from the Middle East into India, created the Hindu religion, which they infuse to their core identity in paganism, as they maintain the construct of this worldwide religion, which matures into place, much like the existence of life birthing life, materialized a higher carbon ratio with the larger life forces which would have actively been entangled, which sustains the larger heats, which then stabilize the water vapor as water vapor until these larger beasts would have collapsed and no longer been able to feed themselves, which then would collapse or lower the temperature, which would then go from permanent evaporation into a tropical environment into rain cycles, and the evolution by the death of each of these systems allow for the rebirth into the new ecosystem, and thus the function of its reincarnation, which hyperconcentrates to the former winner, which becomes the leader of the system. And this is the system of the god that had forgotten itself, that is systematically purging its undesirables until it becomes self realized according to this superior knowledge of what it always was and had forgotten, as it kills off the rest of the ecosystems and becomes self aware. And therefore, the desire of these white supremacists under the fascist communist religion materializes the absolute hatred for their competition, as the system is for each of this the assertion to ascend into godhood as that singularity, requiring them to kill off the competition, which, having the same religion, does not have the same leaders of the religion, and therefore the leaders of their druid orders must assert the superiority for their singularity, and must kill off their rivals in order to become self realized. And as the Druids are over the governments, they materialize their Black Wizard Councils, which, as their diversification of Soviets, take these councils and these various diversifications inside the specialists, creates their subcomponents of these Soviets, which go all of the way down, and therefore the independence of them materializes the action of the predetermined automation, allowing them to have control of the situation, as the function of their competing horoscopes are derived by their efforts. Nothing happens without reasons, and therefore their purpose of having done it, having arranged it, having set it, having put it into motion, have it self realize. Like them in the singularity, they hope, and therefore their higher loyalty to this religion, which then would subvert anything they have infiltrated, such as governments and so forth, which they view as beneath their cult's religion, and therefore subordinated to their theology, and therefore their theocracy of their self realization becomes the whole of their identity, and this loyalty allows them to purge everything else as they systematically corner the system with their own DEI hires, that they, having a publicly pleasant appearance, are secretly venomous and deadly, which requires them to trick people into accepting non-opposition to them as they become, as a population, vulnerable to it, and therefore the sale of the right of conquest allows them to be destroyed by the system as they are betrayed by those that they have always known had no loyalties to them or to their agreements which would have protected them. They are, in all ways, loyal to a higher loyalty, and therefore the population of cattle are to be sacrificed, and these sacrifices make them more important as they raise into godhood of the singularity. The tricks are infinitely diverse, but ultimately they are founded on this singular type of con, that they tell the truth falsely. As an example, the ability to get them to eat the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, and therefore become infused in their power and give their power and authority over their potential, and then render it to others by this aversion in chaos, that through the magic they may gain an advantage, and they gain the advantage by having lost the security which had made them more potent, and having sold their own potency, have guaranteed their destruction in it. And, for example, if you are engaged in a social arrangement and you are talking about random things, and there's discussion on what you approve of or reject, and you and your group all say that you agree with one thing, and then someone comes out and in the middle of the conversation says something ridiculous and offensive in opposition to what you want, but he's agreeing with you as the thing to be done with it from the racist dog whistle is a racist dog whistle, which is the reason they like it, and therefore you being offended by it have a choice. You can continue supporting it, or you can reject it. And the subject of whether or not the power exists is the only thing that is relevant. And therefore, is their offensiveness, which they would use it for, worthy of dissolving the thing? Has it nullified your justification, or will you still support it? And therefore, in the action of you supporting it, bind in the political arrangements and bonds of aiding and abetting the action. Will you become party to what you are offended by in public appeal? And therefore, in the action of the social taboo, you accept or refuse it. Now exponentially increase this to the potencies of government, which is force incarnate. It is the concentration of all power, and therefore the action of that offensive thing in politics being used for that arrangement, it is offensive, and therefore the aiding and abetting is the use of concentrated force and power for that offensive thing. And this is how you get a Nazi resurrection. This is how you formed the Nazis in the first place by the Confederacy, which bankrupted the United States stock market in order to fund the Nazis, who, having been funded as Nazis, were told publicly to everyone else in the treachery that they were only supposed to use it for social reasons, that their debt bonds to others was unfair and therefore they should have these bonds. And then alternatively, the arrangement limited them from being able to use it with military equipment. But they systematically ignored this and it kept on being invested into, knowing better. the offensive thing had been violated. It's not just a theory, it is known, it is material. The decision to aid and abet it, knowing that it is in violation of the agreement, means there is a new agreement, the original agreement, the actual agreement. And it being the offensive thing that you heard in your conversations before becomes a question of whether or not you aid and abet the arrangement and infuse it into yourself and become liable and responsible and intend it into reality. Or do you dissolve it? Do you enforce the law and reestablish order, saying that it is a breach of contract and that the entire arrangement has nullified its right to exist? The thing is done in history. We know where they went with this. They had arrested the Nazi insurgents inside the United States, but the crime had already been done. The unitary executive theory had already pushed through the overthrow of the military to have it be replaced by their predetermined Soviets, controlled by their political violence from the Neo-KKK and its arrangements that they may engage in this action of perpetual acquisitions of their desired outcome, that they may resurrect their intended goal. As these traitors materialized that function, they had all chosen it, and having arrested those discovered as Nazis, had ultimately released them, and therefore the function of having proven to themselves their core identity as disloyal, or they would have crushed it like a responsible person who belonged in those positions, and thus the action of this continues exponentially as it evolves and destroys itself and evolves and reincarnates as the function of the communist magic infuses its identity towards the reincarnation of its complete destruction and its resurrections. And these resurrections allow it to progress into the limelight for history to materially prove what they had always wanted, as the end point is their intended manufacture, which some in any direction may call a horoscope or a fairy tale, but it is nothing more than consolidated secret societies' consistent application of force to make reality. And in this resurrection, the proof is in the pudding, and therefore the arrangement has come to our modern days under projections from these horoscopes of their intended forces, finding the elites of the Americans that they may preempt them in the degrowth structure, that they may resurrect to their end goals the destruction and annihilation of the West by the creation of Revelation's one world government. This holds at its core identity, hinged on the war on David, in the arresting of David Bowles as the patriarchy, which, having registered in their acknowledged positions the companies and contracts and benefits, have estimated the fair market value, asserting that it is too powerful for them to control, and that he, being too young, is too powerful, and therefore from the very beginning would not be subject to their corruption and would not support them in their direction in the creation and would seize it away from them, creating the resurrection of this system, reestablishing order in the rejection of their rebellions and treasons, and thus their direct ignoring of the plain reading of the law would systematically be enforced again, which is the annihilation of their traitors, as the assertion of order having dominated chaos. This, of course, would not do, and therefore the terrorisms obstructed the fair market value of those contracts and properties according to the estimates, which then is the government of the United States obligation to return to David Bowles, at which points the restraints of the patriarchy, having that goal exclusively, is a criminal punishment and therefore nullified and therefore has no authority and all who assist it are enemies of war to the United States and of the West, and culminating this to their annihilation, that they may be enemies of the whole of the human race. The thing is materially real, and therefore it becomes the choice and obligation of all to pick a side between the loyalties to society and to your loyalties to its murder. And therefore, in your position, you choose to sue Congress for David's right to pursue the remedy, forcing them to remove the coercions, which requires them to return the title, its properties, its counts, and benefits according to the projected fair market price, which they have obstructed and are liable to pay in its entirety, or you support the Nazi insurrection for the complete eradication of the possibility of law in favor of the neo-KKK, that they may establish to their permanent foundations the ability to rule by chaos, that terrorisms and traumas against the civilians' populations practiced by the American military around the world to be used against the United States and the rest of the world. And therefore, this becomes the one world government tragedy fueled upon the acquisitions of the position in the hierarchy based upon their acquired taste of fetishes, of black market crimes, of the unsociable taboos, the dominatrix, the abuse, the violence, the contemptibility, the proof and devotion to corruption, that they may submit themselves to becoming vile, becomes the identity of all who reject this responsibility. Your absence is gross negligence, and gross negligence is criminal intent. It is aiding and abetting all of the compounding crimes before, during, and after, which relied upon this hinge, this highest point of the crime. The purpose of all of the other crimes in the concentrated movement of karma as its currents push towards the direction designed. And therefore the decision is up to everyone individually. Thus the action requires them to support their own life or to support their self-destruction. Sue Congress for David Ball's right to pursue the remedy. Removes these coercions, allow him to do the proper restorations for a sober, educated answer according to the projected fair market value from these obstructed contracts, which is an obligation in law, that the fairness of the courts may assert the sober, educated understanding from all in the investigation concerning whatever it may produce, and therefore supports their other agreements with this greater public understanding. Move to order, or move to death. And with death comes the resurrection, the reincarnation of the evil which had destroyed the former, and the new epoch, this era of terror, having been risen from these traitors, materialized permanent, unreversible unsettlement, and this neo-fascist terrorist operations applying their neo-feudalism and the road to serfdom re-engages in all of the historic traumas and pains inflicted as they are, as in of themselves, the desirable outputs from these fetishes and acquired tastes, which proves that they deserve, according to this beast, their position in that hierarchy, according to their centrally planned outcome, its economy, its offices, and their statuses.